Chapter 3, called The Hat and the Superglue, sees Matilda taking action after being ridiculed and enraged by her father, and to a lesser extent her mother, in the previous chapter. So this is where she plans to take action and revenge, and this is the first little incident where she starts taking control. So there's also in this chapter Mr. Wormwood, who is the main subject of the revenge, and Mrs. Wormwood to a lesser extent, as we will see. This first passage, once again, looks at the themes we've been seeing: the difference in power between adults and children, and also the power of fighting injustice, that is, Matilda taking control over the situation in as much as she can. This is from the opening of the chapter pretty much, and it's describing Matilda executing her evil plan. So she had to stand on her toes and reach up as high as she could with a walking stick in order to hook the hat off the peg. And even then, she only just made it. The hat itself was one of those flat-top pork pie jobs with a jay's feather stuck in the headband. And Mr. Wormwood was very proud of it. He thought it gave him a rakish, daring look, especially when he wore it at an angle with his loud checked jacket and green tie. The description here sees the tiny Matilda trying to get the hat. And then the description of the hat is all about Mr. Wormwood, obviously being quite a vain character. He's this flat-topped pork pie jobs, so the job being the thing, the hat itself, with a feather stuck in the headband. It's all a bit much. It's a bit of an exaggeration of an accessory for a man, for a businessman, and I love the way that he describes that he thought it gave him a rakish, daring look. So he obviously thinks he looks pretty snazzy. Rakish, daring look. Rakish is very confident and stylish. And this is, the narrator is poking fun at the fact that he doesn't look that way at all. Now, what happens is, after describing it like this, Mr. Wormwood puts on a hat, and as we know, he's unable to remove it. So for all his pride in his hat, he spends the rest of the day looking like an absolute fool. And so there is nothing rakish or daring about the hat. And although he's trying to look like there's no issue with it, he goes to the car dealership, has to have it on. He works on the cars with it on. And he's obviously, and as the chapter progresses, he gets angrier and angrier as it goes, and more frustrated about what's happening, because he doesn't understand how can it be he puts on this hat that he cannot take off. Finally, what happens is that Matilda has been able to get a one-up on him. And although Mr. Wormwood kind of feels, there's a part when he says he glared at his daughter with deep suspicion when he gets back home. He can't blame her, because he can't possibly think that such a small girl could have anything to do with this incident. So to be fair to him, he keeps quiet about this, and he doesn't attack her directly about what's happened. Also, we see Matilda being quite clever about her, asking innocent questions about whether her father's head has swollen, perhaps, and looking with large, innocent brown eyes. So this over here, we have Matilda has succeeded in embarrassing her father significantly. And although it's not a permanent, power move over her father, it's still a little victory. And of course, it comes from the fact that the adults just can't imagine that Matilda is capable of doing this. So they completely underestimate her and how clever she is. Whereas us as readers know how her mind works, and that she's been plotting this and everything that she's done to get to this point. This next passage is very sweet because, again, Matilda's casually giving her anecdote about this other kid who got his finger stuck in his nose due to some super glue. And again, it shows that she's a pretty good actress. She's playing around with the scene herself and having quite a bit of fun. So Matilda says, "There's a boy down the road who got some super glue on his finger without knowing it, and then he put his finger to his nose." Mr. Wormwood jumped. "What happened to him?" he spluttered. "The finger got stuck inside his nose," Matilda said, "and he had to go around like that for a week. People kept saying to him, 'Stop picking your nose!' And he couldn't do anything about it. He looked an awful fool." And here, this little comment that she passes, "He looked an awful fool." It's again, it's taking a jab at her own father. He looked an awful fool. It's almost saying, "Dad, you look like an awful fool with, your hat stuck there." And what happens is that the mother, as you know, Mrs. Wormwood, says, "Well, the child shouldn't have stuck his nose up his nose. It's a disgusting thing to do." And then Matilda puts one in. Matilda said, "Grown-ups do it too, Mummy. I saw you doing it yesterday in the kitchen." "That's quite enough from you," Mrs. Wormwood said, turning pink. So this little comment here, and also the way Mrs. Wormwood obviously reacts to her daughter, putting her in her place and pointing out what she saw her doing herself, is an extra win for Matilda, and the readers love it. It's like going, yes, this is also a nice thing that happened to Matilda, and she managed to embarrass her. It's kind of a byproduct of the initial trick on her dad. And so we can see this as another victory. So it's another incident where Matilda, who hadn't planned this, manages to embarrass her mother as well as her father. And also she's pointing out the faults that are clear to the readers, but also pointing out the faults indirectly or subtly to her own parents, telling her parents, "Well, you're not that perfect either," even though they are unable to see it themselves. The other thing that we encounter, which can be seen in this passage here, is that Mr. Wormwood obviously has gone from the previous chapter, he's being very arrogant and cocky and proud of himself, and he thinks he wears his hat because he thinks it's stylish, and his very glaring suits and ties and shirt colors and all of this. And after a whole day of traipsing about with this hat stuck, he can't get it off, he can't do anything, he has to wear it all night, wear it at dinner, wear it, can't have a shower even because he can't remove it. So then he has turned into a source of ridicule, which we also see Mrs. Wormwood commenting on this to herself, of course. She's not going to say that out loud, but whereas in the previous chapter she jumped to defend Mr. Wormwood, this little trick that Matilda has pulled has almost, in a sense, destabilized a bit the relationship that Mr. and Wormwood have. If nothing else, we see Mrs. Wormwood continues to be a very superficial woman, because we'll look at this passage. And later on, as she watched her skinny little husband skulking around the bedroom in his purple striped pajamas with a pork pie hat on his head, she thought how stupid he looked. Hardly the kind of man a wife dreams about, she told herself. So in conclusion, we can say that even though this isn't a victory of tremendous impact, and it's maybe short-lived. Maybe it's a little ineffective in terms of changing the permanent power structures that there are between the parents and the adult, and the parents and the child. It doesn't really matter, because at least Matilda feels vindicated. Matilda feels that she got one up on her parents. And also the audience, of course, in terms of humor, in terms of the book, the audience, I mean, it's described in an extremely funny way, to imagine Mr. Wormwood there with Matilda describing that the leather bits, once they've cut off the hat, look like lice, and all of his hair missing. And it's an absolute disaster for someone who was so vain and felt so fanciful about himself. But that's the payback that you get for being mean, is kind of the moral of the story. And Matilda managed to get that